So I have with me the Samsung S22, which I've been using over the last couple of months. Now, Samsung hasn't made too many changes from last year's S21, but I do think they've made slight improvements that refine their Galaxy S series. Design-wise, the S22 looks pretty much the same as last year's model. It still has an IP68 water rating, the same centered hole punch for the 10 megapixel front-facing camera, the same in-display fingerprint sensor, and the same camera hump and button layout. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of this button layout. Having all the buttons on one side of your phone makes it a little awkward to take screenshots with your right hand. It's not the end of the world, but I do find it a little annoying sometimes. What I am a big fan of though is the camera hump. It's personal preference of course, but I just like the way this thing looks. It actually looks like it's supposed to be part of the phone, rather than something the designers chucked in at the last second. And I think it's pretty aesthetic. You're not really going to see it if you put a case on your phone, but it's still something I appreciate. Externally, one of the most notable changes is probably the glass on the back of the phone, which replaces the plastic from last year. For me, I didn't mind the plastic from last year's S21. It was plastic, but it didn't feel like cheap plastic, and it was probably more shatter resistant than this year's glass back as well. That being said, the glass on this year's model does feel nice, and the extra weight adds a bit of heft to the phone, which feels quite premium in the hand. It weighs just about the same as last year's model, even though the S22's display is an inch smaller. That's right. For the first time in Samsung's flagship Galaxy S series, Samsung has actually decided to reduce the size of the new generation's display compared to the previous generation. Last year's S21 had a 6.2-inch display, but the S22's display is 6.1 inches. Size aside, it's a 2340 by 1080 AMOLED display and it hits a peak brightness of 1300 nits. The display also has a 120Hz adaptive refresh rate, which is always a welcome feature for some buttery scrolling while also being able to ramp down to conserve battery life. Although the screen is slightly smaller this year, it's still a great looking display. It's vibrant and responsive, and the brightness is more than enough for indoor and outdoor use. When you're scrolling through the web, the 120Hz refresh rate makes such a big difference compared to a standard 60Hz screen, and it makes the phone feel so much more responsive. One thing I've found that I do have to be aware of though, is the saturation on the S22's display and how it affects photos. Anecdotally, a lot of people around me have said they love the way photos look on the S22, and I think it's because the display has those vibrant, saturated colors. But you just have to keep that in mind when taking photos, that it might not actually look the same when viewed on other devices. In terms of size, I do enjoy how compact the phone feels in the hand. But if I had an opportunity to pick the size again, I think I'd actually opt for the bigger S22 Plus. It's all personal preference, but I like seeing more on the screen when I'm working on my phone, like when I'm typing up notes or editing a photo. The lack of screen real estate is especially noticeable if you leave your font size on the default setting. The text on apps like Notion are scaled up so big on the default setting, you're hardly getting any usable screen. So I found that setting the font size smaller works best. Okay, so underneath the display is of course the ultrasonic fingerprint sensor. I just want to talk about it a little bit because I'm just personally impressed by how well this thing works. When Samsung first introduced the ultrasonic fingerprint sensor to the Galaxy S series back in the S10, it worked pretty nicely, but it was definitely a bit slower, and there were more than a couple occasions where it wouldn't recognize my finger at all. It was still usable back then, but I found myself resorting back to drawing the pattern because the scanner just wasn't that consistent. Well, this is a couple iterations on now, and it has gotten significantly better. Sometimes a quick tap is enough to unlock your phone. It's really accurate, really snappy, and it's just great to see how far this fingerprint sensor has come along. Alright, so internally, the S22 has a Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 or an Exynos 2200 processor, depending on your region. I've got the Snapdragon chip here, but both iterations have 8 gigs of RAM with an option of either 128 gigs or 256 gigs of storage. Unfortunately, just like the S21, there's no longer an option to expand your storage with a micro SD card. That aside, the phone performs well. Gaming is smooth, and of course being a flagship Samsung phone, it benchmarks well. Something I was a little worried about was the smaller battery this year. Given that the phone is smaller, the battery has actually been bumped down from last year's 4000 mAh battery to a 3700 mAh battery. Using it daily though, I've found I've still been able to squeeze a day's usage out of the phone on a single charge. That's just with some messaging, music, note-taking, and social media. But if you're using your phone for more taxing apps like games, you might run into a bit of an issue without a midday charge. Alright, although Samsung's camera hump looks pretty much identical to last year's, they've actually rejigged the cameras inside. Inside you'll find a new 50 megapixel main camera, a 10 megapixel 3x telephoto, and a 12 megapixel ultra-wide camera. Photos on the S22 are solid. Samsung's choice of camera and software processing are producing some great results at the moment. Photos are sharp, colors are accurate to the scene, and you're going to get some pretty consistently nice photos out of this camera. Just be aware though, as I mentioned earlier, photos viewed on this display will appear a bit more saturated than on other devices. So, a software improvement that Samsung really wants you to know about is their improved nighttime photography, going so far as to name it nightography. I found that the S22 relies quite heavily on software post-processing for its photos in low light settings. The upside to this is that you're still able to capture detailed photos even in low light situations. But the downside is that what you're seeing on the phone screen as you're taking the photo doesn't actually reflect the final result. So even if a scene doesn't look fantastic as you're taking the photo, the end result might actually look alright. This is especially noticeable when there's a bright light source in your shot. It's just a little something extra you'll have to take into account when you're taking photos. Video-wise, the S22 performs well. I haven't really run into any hiccups with autofocus while recording, and colors in the video are crisp. I don't think it's as good as iPhone footage, but it's still pretty good, and it's more than enough for everyday recording. You also have the option to shoot in 8K at 24 frames per second, although I haven't found myself using this feature that often. File sizes are roughly 30% larger than the phone's 4K 30 FPS recordings, which really eats away at your phone's storage, especially given that it's not expandable. Plus, I think 8K is probably a bit overkill for everyday recording. That being said, having the option is always nice, and if you're planning to use this phone in the long term, this might actually be a feature you find yourself using more often as 8K becomes more popular. So, I've found that shooting on the move produces decent results as well, with Samsung making improvements to the S22's optical image stabilization as well as its video digital stabilization compared to last year's model. Samsung claims that the optical image stabilization has a 58% wider correction angle compared to last year's S21, with a video digital image stabilization that analyzes 4 times more motion as well. And I think it shows. I really don't have to put in too much effort while recording on the move, and the S22 delivers video that's decently fluid. Alright, so under the hood, the S22 runs the latest One UI 4, which is Samsung's overlay over Android 12. One UI combines the great features from Android and adds some Samsung spice, adding their own UI design flair. It was actually introduced alongside the S10 back in 2019, with the goal to provide a more natural experience on smartphones with larger screens, and that's still the case now. You'll find that Samsung apps still sport a half-screen interface to make it easier to access useful information with one hand. In fact, this year Samsung has even brought their design language over to Google Messages. Straight out of the box, the S22 ships with Google Messages as the default messaging app, so they've put their own skin on it, meaning it now has that half-screen UI design and fits more in line with Samsung apps. Now, something that's been of interest to me, being someone who also uses Apple devices, is the progress of Samsung's ecosystem. With Apple's seamless integration between their iPhones, MacBooks, and iPads, Samsung has made partnerships not only with Google, who of course develops Android and helps integrate its features into Samsung products, but also with Microsoft. With Link to Windows, the S22 can connect to a Windows computer, meaning you can send messages, share photos, access apps, and make calls from your PC without having to touch your phone. Besides the Surface Duo, which is Microsoft's own phone, these integrations are Samsung exclusive, and the features work pretty well. I found it pretty useful being able to access everything on your computer, and it just makes my workflow a bit smoother. But the S22 doesn't just give you a way to connect to a computer. If you connect the S22 to a monitor, the S22 is able to provide a genuinely functional desktop experience through Samsung DeX, which I don't think Samsung gets enough credit for. It's still your phone, but now it's presented to you in a more traditional desktop interface, and when you access your apps, they appear as windows that you can move around and arrange to your liking. Having access to that big screen and the use of Windows has really allowed me to do proper work sessions without the use of a computer. By default, the S22 will convert its screen to a trackpad, but you also have the option of connecting an external keyboard and mouse via Bluetooth. In this mode, it even supports keyboard shortcuts like Alt-Tab, Ctrl-C and Ctrl-V, and snapping a window to the left or the right of the screen with the window and arrow keys. So when I say it's a desktop experience, I really mean it. And alright, look, the S22 will not be able to do everything that a desktop or laptop can, but to have this option in a tiny phone, it's pretty amazing. Oh, and Samsung has promised 4 years of major Android updates and 5 years of security updates, which is a Samsung first but also beats Google's own Pixel lineup. This means you can buy the phone with confidence that you'll get new software over the next couple of years. The Samsung S22 has been a solid all-round phone that gives a fantastic Android experience. It has one of the best displays on the market along with one of the best processors on the market and software that's packed with features, like DeX and Windows integrations. And yes, it doesn't introduce any crazy new features we haven't seen before, but it does make improvements where it counts. One of the main things people use their phones for is its camera system, and Samsung has made improvements to both photo and video processing, which is producing some great results. Having used the phone for a while now, would I recommend it? Yes, I would. Alright, those are my thoughts on the Samsung S22. If you liked the video, please consider dropping a like and subscribing. And let me know, what do you guys think about the S22? Do you like what Samsung's doing with its software? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.